Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our story of Pensacola, North America's first place city, a story of more than 450 years duration. In earlier episodes, we talked about the beginnings of Spain in Florida, which of course involved explorers and then the ill-fated expedition of Don Tristan de Luna of 1559. At that time, just following the de Luna expedition, the Spanish succeeded in placing a colony opposite us on the panhandle at St. Augustine. And from that colony, the Spanish extended to a series of missions coming just about as far west as Tallahassee, which they called at that point Tallahassee. Surprisingly enough, the area on which we live, in which our story is based at Pensacola, had a 138-year blank period. Now, in all of that time, the Spanish were extremely busy in Latin America. They extended their colonies all the way south to the southern tip of South America itself. They began an extensive settlement of Mexico, but for reasons known only to them at that time, they did little and cared little for the North Gulf Coast. And so our story is a total blank from the year 1561 until the latter part of the 1690s. And then things began to change. And of course, to understand where we stood, we have to recognize some of the things that were going on across the colonial world. First of all, the English, beginning in 1607, had succeeded in placing a series of colonies along the Atlantic coast. There were 12 of them by the end of the 17th century, ranging from New Hampshire to the Carolinas. The French had begun settlement in a different way. They had moved into the St. Lawrence Valley in 1608 with a colony established first of all on Nova Scotia's island, and then moving a little bit more inland to what we now call Quebec City, where Champlain was the basic settler. 16 years later, 1624, a second colony led by Cartier established a new settlement at what they called Mount Royal or Montreal. And from that point forward, through the balance of the 17th century, the French were extremely active in Canada. They developed a wonderful trade with the Native American tribes there. Now, we have to talk a little bit about why that trade was so successful. It began, of course, in Holland. And a Dutch hat maker discovered a formula which could be applied to skins and furs to make them much more pliable and much more easily rendable into clothing, and particularly hats. And the story goes, it's a kind of a funny story. It goes sort of like this. This substance that this hat maker used involved the use of fulminate of mercury. And the scientists tell us that if someone works with the fumes from fulminate of mercury long enough, their reason begins to dwindle and they become, well, a little bit like this. And consequently, the saying arose in the 17th century that someone might be as mad as a hatter, and that's where that particular phrase came from. Well, anyway, the French became almost monopolists as far as the Indian trade was concerned, and into the 1680s, they were very successful in working with the Indians and sending materials back. The English got into that business, not along the St. Lawrence River where the French were, but much farther north along Hudson's Bay. But that really is not part of our story here for Pensacola. We move into the 1680s. The English are along the Atlantic coast, the French are along the St. Lawrence Valley. And at this point in time, a young man named Robert Sieur de La Salle came into our story. Now, La Salle was the fourth son of a relatively important noble family with lots of dealings at the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. La Salle was one of those people who, if there's a river, we want to swim it. If there's a mountain, we want to climb it. He's one of those people who just had an adventurous nature. And so he made his trip to New France and was in Montreal looking about, and he came in contact with a number of the Native Americans there who claimed that they had made a voyage, a trip, which had taken them through several very large lakes and then to a river which literally bisected all of North America, and they had followed that river down to a new ocean. Of course, they had no name for it. This idea, this story fascinated La Salle. And so he determined that he would use a little of his money, and he put together a team of about 50 men. There were a few Frenchmen, the rest of them were Native Americans. They got into large canoes and they started moving along the St. Lawrence, then across into the what we could today call the Great Lakes. They moved all the way down, north to south, across Lake Michigan, entered the Illinois River, and finally entered the Mississippi itself. Then they made the trip all the way down across past the bluffs, past the farm country, to the Mississippi River. And of course, they then broke into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, LaSalle immediately had a wonderful idea, at least he thought so. He said, what we could do as a country, since the Spanish have simply neglected this area, we could begin a series of colonial positions along the river and then actually fortify the southern part of the delta, and we could create a new empire for France and literally cut out the Spanish, and we could trade all along the river with the Indian tribes. And so he rushed. No, I can't say that. He didn't rush back up the Mississippi. If one ever has paddled a canoe, you know you don't exactly rush up a river like that. But he made the journey and immediately took ship back to France. And here he received an audience with King Louis XIV and explained his idea. The king listened, and he thought the plan was sound. And so they put together a group. I don't know how many colonists there were because the record doesn't tell us. But in any event, the shipment of these people from the port of Brest was rather unique because the vessels involved were to have also a second colonial group going somewhere, and again, our story doesn't tell us where. But in any event, LaSalle and his colonists boarded the vessel in Brest and started the voyage to the west. Now, this is one of those stories, it's almost like a part of our DeLuna story, because as they sailed west, along the panhandle of Florida, they somehow or other missed the opening to the bay here at Pensacola, and they also missed the opening of the Mississippi River. The river, of course, was much clogged up with all sorts of debris and logs and other material, so they sailed right on past, and finally they reached basically what we today call the Neches River in Texas. And here the captain of the fleet did something that, well, it's unexplainable, but he did it. He told LaSalle and his people, I'm sorry, we've got an appointment to put these other folks off somewhere else. You have got to get off. Well, of course, LaSalle was absolutely furious, but he was not in command. He was forced to do that. And so LaSalle's company disembarked, and they set up shop, beginning a village about where Port Arthur, Texas is today. LaSalle got them started, and then he took a key group of people and began moving back to the east, intending to put his intended village, of course, right at the mouth of the Mississippi. Well, we don't know exactly what happened next, but apparently LaSalle was not exactly the easiest man to get along with. And so he made some unfortunate relationships with this group he was with, and one night, as they were encamped somewhere along the Louisiana coastline, someone slipped into his tent, and the next thing the story goes, LaSalle was dead. The balance of his companions there simply disappeared into the woods, and only a fragment of the story survives for us. Well, that ended the story as far as LaSalle was concerned, but about the same time, and we're now into the point of about 1685, word comes back to the viceroy of New Spain in Mexico City that there is a French colony somewhere along the Gulf. Well, of course, as far as the viceroy is concerned, this is strictly forbidden because by edict this is supposed to be Spanish territory. So immediately he dispenses a small fleet led by an explorer named Jourdan Riain, and Riain moves forward to try and see, are the French there? Well, he sailed about here and there, and the story goes that he landed here and looked about here in present-day Pensacola and found nothing, and he came back to the viceroy and said, no, there's nothing to it. Well, about a year later, an English trader happened to come into Mexico itself and got an appointment with the viceroy. This man's name was Heights, and he said, "Sir, I have been there. I have been in the area to the north of Mexico, and there is a French colony there." So once again, the viceroy sent forth another expedition by vessel, and they found nothing. And then the very next year, a group of Spanish soldiers just moving out of Mexico itself to explore what was in Texas, they came upon the remains of the French colony, the LaSalle colony. There was no one there. The village had been burned, and of course the local Indians there would say nothing. They would claim they knew nothing about this, but obviously the French had been there. and this sent a signal to the viceroy. So immediately he put forth a quick plan and sent a messenger to Spain, to Madrid, asking the King's Council to prepare both the funding and some people so that the Spanish could finally move out and start something on the Gulf to show the Spanish flag there. And the message, unfortunately, was never returned. And about this same time, the viceroy himself was replaced, and a new viceroy named the Count de Galvez appeared, and he was now in charge of this area. Well, at this time, we have to stop just a moment and talk about what was happening in Spain, because this has a great relationship to our story. Those of you who remember their high school or college biology lessons will remember that there was always a section in the textbook that dealt with genetics. And almost always the example that they used as the horrible example, if we can put it that way, was the King of Spain at this time, who had the title of King Carlos II. Carlos was the 7th generation of descendants who had come beginning back in the time of Philip II and the De Luna period. Carlos was descended from one of King Philip's children, who unfortunately goes down in history as Joanna the Mad. And she was married to a Habsburg prince, and their children, of course, were married into a variety of royal families across Western Europe, and the Spanish throne followed this line, so that by the time we reached Carlos II, this poor man had gone through seven generations of intermarriage, and he was, unfortunately, a very ill-disposed person. His mentality kind of went in sine waves. Sometimes he would be sharp as a tack, other days he would be, well, literally, figuratively in terms of our present-day jargon, he was out in left field somewhere. He was married twice, and there were no offspring. And so as we reached the early part of the 1690s, the Spanish Council was very concerned, because in those days no one could rule in a Western monarchy unless he or she had royal blood. And of course there was no offspring from Carlos. So now people in the council were beginning to worry about what was happening. Who would the successor be? Well, as all of this was going on, the new viceroy, de Galvez, said, well, we have got to do something. So he determined to make a study that would be impressive to the council. And he appointed two men, two very able members of his community there. One was the former Admiral Andreas de Pez, and the second was Father Carlos Siguenza, who was the master theologian and also explorer and archaeologist, I guess we might say, with the new university that had been established by the Spanish in Mexico City. These two men set out, and they made a voyage, and they stopped at virtually every sizable port, every harbor, any place along the Gulf of Mexico, and to determine what would be the proper place for us to place a colony if we decided to move there. Why they did not have all the material and all the definitions from the De Luna expedition, we don't know, but they did not. And these two men made their studies, they went from place to place, and they came back to Mexico and presented their findings to the viceroy. And his immediate reaction was, this is wonderful. And he turned to De Pez, he said, I want you to develop now a plan for a colony, a fortified colony that we can place somewhere on the North Shore, and you're telling us now that you are picking out this place here that has a wonderful harbor, it's a beautiful site. And the Pez and Seguin say, yes, this is it. And they called the place, of course they were buttering up the viceroy just a little bit. They called this the new Plaza de Galvez, for naming it for the viceroy. This, of course, was the same place that Don Tristan de Luna had attempted to settle about 138 years before. So all of this was put in form, and the viceroy then ordered de Pez to go to Madrid and place the plan in front of the council and the king. And de Pez took ship, and off he went and made the beginnings of his study. But at this point in time, we will say to you, come back for the next episode, which will appear shortly.